Welcome to today's deep dive. I want to start off by posing a geostrategic paradox to you.
Oh, those are always the best kind.
Right. Okay, so imagine a massive, overwhelming military strike, a fully coordinated operation specifically engineered to completely shatter a foreign government by taking out its absolute top tier of leadership.
A textbook decapitation strike.
Exactly. Now, imagine that exact same kinetic strike somehow accidentally making that targeted government stronger, like more structurally unified and significantly more resilient.
Which completely defies conventional military logic.
It really does. I mean, how does that actually happen on the ground? That is the exact puzzle we're dissecting today. We have our hands on a really dense, incredibly high-stakes document.
Yeah, this one is heavy.
It is. It's titled Geostrategic Analysis of the Second Iran War and the Succession of Iran's Third Supreme Leader. It's a rigorous assessment written by Dr. Fareed Novin, and it's dated today, March 8, 2026.
Meaning it is as fresh as it gets.
Absolutely. For context, today marks day 9 of what the report officially designates as Operation Epic Fury.
Now, before we delve into the mechanics of this report, I need to provide a crucial objective framing for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's really important here.
Because this source material contains highly charged, politically sensitive content regarding a hypothetical 2026 war involving the U.S., Iran, Israel, Russia, and China, I want to explicitly state that we are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, nor are we validating the policies or military doctrines of any nation, whether left-wing or right-wing. Our sole mission in this deep dive is to impartially report, unpack, and convey the strategic analysis contained strictly within the author's report.
We're just looking at the math.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are entirely focused on the structural logic and the strategic modeling presented in this document.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp the scale of the author's analysis, we have to look at the timeline.
Because the sheer density of events is staggering.
It's unreal.
Yeah.
Compressed into just the last 9 days, it has fundamentally reshaped the global board. The entire sequence kicks off on February 28, 2026.
Day 1.
Day 1. The report details a massive pre-dawn military Operation Epic Fury. And the timing the author highlights here is, well, it's staggering.
Because of what happened the day before.
Right. This operation launches just a single day after Oman's foreign minister publicly stated that a comprehensive peace was within reach.
Following extensive back-channel talks in Geneva.
Yeah. It was an absolute whiplash moment for the international community. The strike itself, led by Israel and the U.S., was a maximalist decapitation effort.
It was designed to clear the board.
It successfully targeted and killed Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, along with several of his immediate family members.
That included his daughter, son-in-law, grandson, and daughter-in-law.
A total wipeout of the inner circle. It also took out the top tier of the military brass, the defense minister and the commander of the IRGC. The primary strategic objective outlined in the planning was regime fragmentation.
The operational theory was simple enough. Sever the head and watch the various internal factions tear the rest of the state apart in a vacuum.
But the immediate fallout, documented in the report, demonstrates a catastrophic failure of that specific theory.
Yeah, the regional backlash wasn't fragmented at all. It was instantaneous and highly coordinated.
According to the timeline, Iran immediately launched retaliatory ballistic missile and drone salvos against U.S. military installations across the entire Gulf region.
We're talking about simultaneous strikes impacting Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE.
Alongside strikes hitting infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Simultaneously, Tehran declared the total closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
And their Houthi proxies immediately resumed aggressive anti-shipping operations in the Red Sea.
In the span of just 9 days, the report catalogs 1,850 total fatalities across the theater. Tragically, that number includes 7 U.S. service members.
Who were killed during a targeted drone strike on Kuwait's port of Shuaibah.
And there is a critical geopolitical fracture point the author emphasizes right at the start. The United States launched this massive decapitation operation without consulting its G7 allies.
No advance briefing, no coalition consensus building, nothing.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the severe alliance friction the report digs into later. But before we get to the global fallout, the timeline takes an incredibly dark turn internally on March 4th.
The Manab strike.
Yes. The report centers on a tragedy that the author argues structurally altered the entire global information environment. A U.S. strike destroyed the Shajarat Tayyebe primary school in Manab, down in southern Iran.
Iranian civil authorities reported that roughly 168 children were killed in the blast.
The U.S. stated it was conducting an investigation, but preliminary findings leaked to the press pointed heavily to an American precision munition going off target.
What's fascinating here is how the author analyzes the strategic impact of this specific event. They completely strip away the emotion to look at the raw informational mechanics.
Right, taking a purely structural view.
Exactly. In the realm of geopolitics and information warfare, a tragedy of this magnitude doesn't just cause localized outrage, it acts as a catalyst for a multi-generational atrocity narrative.
It changes the entire social fabric.
Inside Iran, this single horrific event fundamentally catalyzed a domestic counter-mobilization. It acted as an informational shockwave that shifted the broader public mindset from internal political division and economic frustration to an intense, unified resistance.
The narrative of national martyrdom wasn't just steep propaganda anymore.
No, it began to organically consolidate political identity across demographics that previously opposed the government.
And while that intense domestic consolidation is happening inside Iran, the rhetoric emanating from the outside was escalating just as fast.
Pushing things further to the brink.
Between March 5th and 7th, U.S. President Trump dramatically shifted the stated objectives of the war. He pivoted completely away from the initial framework of protecting against an imminent nuclear threat.
And instead began demanding Iran's unconditional surrender.
He posted on Truth Social that their core leadership was gone and that it was simply too late for any diplomatic talks. Concurrently, major news outlets began confirming that Russia was actively stepping into the void,
providing Iran with highly accurate targeting intelligence for their missile forces.
And then we hit March 8th. This is the bombshell development that anchors the entire geostrategic reassessment in the document.
The succession.
Yeah. While remaining in hiding and reportedly nursing injuries from the initial strikes, 56-year-old Mojtaba Khamenei is officially named Iran's third supreme leader by the Assembly of Experts.
And in immediate response, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, publicly pledges full obedience and self-sacrifice to his new leadership.
Which brings us to the analytical engine of this entire report.
The Bayesian game-theoretic reassessment of the conflict's trajectory.
Okay, this is the part of the methodology I find so compelling. Could you break down what a Bayesian game-theoretic reassessment actually means for the listener?
Absolutely. So the author isn't just offering punditry or guessing what happens next based on gut feeling. A Bayesian reassessment simply means taking your initial assumptions, your baseline probabilities of what you think will happen, and mathematically updating them every time a new piece of information or informational shock enters the system.
So shocks like the school bombing, the new leader, the maximalist rhetoric.
Exactly. Those events mathematically force a complete reassessment of the prior probabilities.
Got it. So we start with scenario A, which was the original strategic goal of the entire decapitation strike regime fragmentation and a managed political transition.
But according to the updated data, the probability of this outcome has plummeted to a mere 10%.
And it continues to decline. So from a structural standpoint, why did the decapitation strike completely fail to trigger the expected fragmentation?
It comes down to a fundamental miscalculation of how elite security institutions actually behave under extreme existential pressure.
The original operational calculus relied heavily on the assumption that the IRGC and the traditional clerical establishment might turn their weapons on each other in the chaotic power vacuum.
Right, left by Ali Khamenei's death. But instead, the exact opposite occurred.
They closed ranks.
They essentially fused together to protect and elevate his successor, Mojtaba. The IRGC didn't use their monopoly on violence to overthrow him.
They utilized it to rapidly facilitate and secure his rise to supreme authority.
The author points out a well-documented geopolitical phenomenon here. Overwhelming external kinetic bombardment almost universally creates a rally around the regime effect.
Because internal political fragmentation is really a luxury of peacetime, isn't it?
Or at least low-level friction. It is highly unlikely to materialize when the state is under an overwhelming external attack.
Particularly an attack that just wiped out the leader's family.
Exactly. In that environment, institutional survival becomes the only shared incentive capable of overriding previous factional disputes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the probability of a quick fragmentation collapsed, Scenario B has now emerged as the clear modal outcome.
Sitting at a 45% probability and steadily rising.
And Scenario B is defined as a sustained attritional war. This isn't a quick victory.
It's a long, grueling, multi-front grind.
And the psychological drivers behind this shift are fascinating.
Yes, the psychological and political mechanics driving this attritional reality are crucial to understand. The author introduces a concept they call the betrayal grievance.
You have to remember the context of the initial strikes. They were launched immediately after Oman publicly signaled that diplomatic peace talks were on the verge of a breakthrough.
Right, and for millions of Iranians, including political moderates, reformists, and pure nationalists who might normally actively oppose the hardline regime,
This sequence of events created a profound structural sense of betrayal.
it completely validated the hardliners' long-standing narrative that Western diplomacy is merely a stalling tactic for military aggression.
It structurally reinforced the legitimacy of armed resistance. You look at the U.S. demand for unconditional surrender in that exact environment, and you have to wonder,
Was it a calculated maximalist negotiating tactic?
or did it just accidentally collapse whatever remaining space there was for Iranian moderates to push for an off-ramp?
The report argues it heavily resulted in the latter. By framing the conflict in absolutely maximalist, unconditional terms, the U.S. essentially erased any political viability for Iranian moderates to advocate for negotiation.
Because if the only option presented by the adversary is total, humiliating capitulation,
Especially following the mass casualties of the MENAB school strike.
then continued armed resistance is no longer viewed domestically as a project of ideological militancy.
It is entirely reframed as defensive nationalism.
Political actors across the entire Iranian spectrum are structurally forced to support the war effort, not out of love for the regime.
But out of basic national preservation.
So if defensive nationalism is locking in this attritional war, you would assume the international back channels are working overtime to find an immediate off-ramp.
You would assume so.
But the math on Scenario C, a negotiated ceasefire via third-party mediation, is completely stalled out.
The report assesses this at a stable but very low 22%.
It hasn't zeroed out completely because Oman is apparently still functioning as an active, trusted back channel.
In fact, the report notes Oman was deliberately excluded from all of the Iranian retaliatory targeting across the Gulf.
But as the author points out, the maximalist public rhetoric is completely paralyzing the actual quiet diplomacy.
You have demands for absolute surrender on one side.
And Iran's president, Pezeshkian, publicly stating that any domestic advocates of surrender will take it to their graves on the other.
Which logically forces the probability of the most dangerous outcome, Scenario D, significantly upward.
Scenario D is a regional conflagration with great power entanglement.
Which the model now assesses at 23% and climbing. And the data points feeding this probability are deeply concerning.
We have confirmation of active Russian intelligence sharing, directly aiding Iran in penetrating Allied air defenses,
We have the activation of deeply entrenched proxy forces.
with the Houthis strangling the Red Sea and Hezbollah escalating in the Levant.
And crucially, we have a widening footprint of Iranian retaliatory strikes across Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia.
The author warns that any single miscalculation in this web of flashpoints, say a ballistic missile hitting a major civilian population center in the Emirates, or a drone strike causing massive U.S. naval casualties,
It threatens to breach the containment threshold.
pulling the entire region and major global powers directly into a theater-wide war.
So what does this all mean for you?
Yeah, if you're listening to this and wondering how a complex geostrategic chess match in the Persian Gulf actually impacts your daily life, the report lays out the cascading economic shockwaves with brutal clarity.
It all comes down to the architecture of global energy.
The statistics documented in the report are staggering. WTI crude oil has already settled at $90.90 a barrel.
Gasoline at the pump in the U.S. has blown past $4 a gallon.
And over in Europe, natural gas prices literally doubled overnight after Iranian drone strikes specifically targeted and degraded Qatari gas export facilities.
And the absolute focal point of this global economic pressure campaign is the Strait of Hormuz.
The report identifies a critical, highly asymmetric tactical maneuver executed by Iran in the strait.
Following the initial strikes, Western commercial tanker traffic passing through the Strait of Hormuz plummeted from an average of roughly 24 vessels a day down to near zero.
Iran issued explicit, credible threats to destroy any U.S., British, or Israeli-linked vessels attempting passage.
However, they made a highly calculated exception.
This detail is absolutely wild to me.
They purposefully allowed Chinese-flagged vessels to transit the strait completely freely and unharassed.
They essentially carved out a VIP commercial lane exclusively for China, right in the middle of a hyperkinetic war zone.
Precisely. By doing so, they created a de facto Chinese energy corridor.
This grants Beijing a massive asymmetric strategic advantage.
China gets to secure its critical energy supply lines while the rest of the global market suffocates. And they achieve this at absolutely zero military or financial cost.
Meanwhile, the rest of the industrialized world is left scrambling to absorb the shock. The ripple effects of that are terrifying.
The report references Goldman Sachs, which estimates that a $14 per barrel risk premium has simply been baked into the global market entirely out of fear and uncertainty.
Even more alarming, Allianz Research has outlined a severe tail risk scenario. Their modeling suggests that if critical Saudi and UAE oil infrastructure sustains major kinetic damage, Brent crude could easily blow past $130 a barrel.
The author states flatly that a price shock of that magnitude would instantaneously trigger a severe global recession.
You look at a country like Japan, which is 90% dependent on Middle Eastern crude imports.
Yeah.
And they're facing an absolute macroeconomic nightmare because they possess no rapid alternative supply chain.
And the sheer pressure of this has forced some bizarre policy contradictions.
Like the waiver. The report notes that the U.S. Treasury was actually forced to issue an emergency 30-day waiver, allowing Indian refineries to purchase sanctioned Russian oil.
Simply to inject enough supply into the market to ease the crushing global pressure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
The great power arithmetic playing out here is deeply troubling for the Western alliance.
Russia and China are currently reaping immense strategic windfalls without firing a single piece of their own ordnance.
For Russia, this Gulf conflict serves as a massive geopolitical heat sink.
Every single U.S. precision munition, interceptor, and Tomahawk missile fired in the Gulf theater is a critical munition that is not being sent to Ukraine.
And it is not being stockpiled in the Indo-Pacific for deterrence.
Moscow's provision of real-time targeting intelligence to Tehran is a textbook application of hybrid warfare.
They maintain a thin veneer of plausible deniability while materially degrading U.S. military effectiveness and draining Western stockpiles.
And China, perfectly shielded by its asymmetric shipping arrangement in Hormuz and its massive pre-war strategic oil stockpiling, gains invaluable strategic patience.
Beijing can simply watch its primary geopolitical competitors exhaust their military resources, their economic resilience, and their political capital in a Middle Eastern quagmire.
Which brings us directly to the vulnerability of the Western allies themselves. The report highlights a massive growing risk of the G7 coalition permanently fracturing over this crisis.
Because the U.S. opted not to consult its partners before launching the initial decapitation strike, the diplomatic fallout is getting incredibly messy.
Switzerland's defense minister publicly broke ranks, calling the attacks a direct violation of international law.
The UK Ministry of Defense is actively minimizing its public role and distancing itself from the escalation.
France and Germany have pointedly refused to endorse the U.S.'s implied regime change goals.
And even domestically inside the U.S., Congress recently rejected a war powers resolution.
Though the author notes that vote was likely driven more by intense domestic political pressure than any unified strategic consensus.
The author's core thesis in this section is vital to internalize. Western alliance unity, not the aggregate count of Iranian centrifuges or the internal coherence of the IRGC, is the ultimate strategic variable determining the outcome of this war.
If the Western alliance fractures, particularly if that fracture occurs over basing access in Gulf states that serve as both indispensable U.S. military launch pads and primary targets for Iranian retaliation.
The logistics of maintaining this attritional war become fundamentally unsustainable for the West.
So how does this incredibly volatile situation actually end? The author doesn't just diagnose the problem. They outline a series of emergency policy recommendations.
And everything revolves around a very specific ticking clock.
A traditional 40-day mourning period for the leaders killed in the initial February 28th strike.
That window closes right around April 9th.
The timing of that 40-day window is critical because of what the author conceptualizes as the Mojtaba Doctrine.
Right. Mojtaba Khamenei is currently navigating a highly delicate transitional phase of power.
If a negotiated ceasefire can be secured before that 40-day morning clock officially expires, he retains the political capital to frame the halt in fighting to his domestic audience as a strategic pause.
He can present himself as a strong, pragmatic leader who successfully stabilized the nation and halted the bombardment while under extreme fire.
But if that window closes without an off-ramp,
His political identity and the foundational legitimacy of his rule will permanently crystallize around a mandate of perpetual, uncompromising resistance.
and the author lays out the exact sequence the G7 needs to execute to successfully hit that narrowing window. First, they have to fully activate the Oman Channel.
Meaning they need to empower France, Germany, and the UK to step in as primary mediators to bypass the toxic US-Iran dynamic.
Second, the U.S. has to quietly but definitively drop the maximalist unconditional surrender demand.
Reframing the diplomatic objective entirely around verifiable nuclear constraints and localized regional security guarantees.
But the third piece of the recommendation is undoubtedly the most intense. The U.S. must publicly acknowledge the findings of the independent investigation into the Minab school strike.
The author specifies this shouldn't be framed as a formal legal admission of war crimes.
Right, but rather as a necessary gesture of humanitarian accountability.
It is a profound and highly contentious point, but the author's logic is purely structural.
They argue that this public acknowledgement is not a moral concession. It is the absolute minimum credibility requirement necessary to provide Mujtaba Khamenei with a viable face-saving frame.
Structurally speaking, he cannot order his forces to stand down and surrender to the exact same foreign powers that just eradicated his family and bombed a primary school.
Not without instantly destroying his own newly minted legitimacy among the hardliners keeping him in power.
The report meticulously notes Mujtaba's internal commitment mechanism. He is perfectly willing to accept 90% economic destruction of his country in exchange for a 10% guarantee of strategic survival.
For him, the survival of the regime and the institutional survival of the IRGC are completely identical to his own physical survival.
If the West refuses to offer a realistic, politically viable off-ramp that respects that unyielding structural constraint, the war of attrition won't end.
It will just continue to indiscriminately grind down the region and the global economy.
So, to synthesize the immense amount of ground we've covered in this deep dive,
A massive, highly coordinated military operation that was explicitly intended to swiftly topple a foreign regime through precision decapitation strikes has, according to this rigorous Bayesian analysis, achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal.
it has permanently institutionalized the regime's most uncompromising hardliners.
It has forced previously fractured political and military institutions to seamlessly merge.
It has sparked a devastating global energy crisis.
It has handed massive, entirely cost-free strategic victories to great power adversaries like Russia and China.
And it has left vital Western alliances straining under the unbearable weight of a grueling, open-ended war of attrition.
It is a textbook, terrifying case study of an overwhelming kinetic action producing an equal, opposite, and highly unpredictable geopolitical reaction.
This raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the immediate mechanics of this hypothetical 2026 scenario and touches on the very foundation of modern strategic thinking.
Where do we go from here?
Well, if the global market and, more importantly, peer adversaries like China now fully understand that Western decapitation doctrines predictably result in de facto Chinese energy monopolies in the Gulf,
While simultaneously draining critical U.S. munitions and fracturing NATO-aligned coalitions.
Exactly. We have to look at the incentive structures going forward. At what point do adversaries begin intentionally weaponizing the West's own military doctrine against it?
Wow.
Do we reach a paradigm where adversaries actively bait Western powers into launching these massive kinetic strikes, knowing full well that the resulting economic exhaustion and alliance friction will inflict far more damage on the West than the strikes themselves could ever achieve?
That is an incredibly chilling thought to mull over as you go about your day. The idea of our own tactical playbooks being turned into strategic traps.
It completely flips the script on deterrence.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Novan's report. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking beyond the headlines, and we will see you next time.